Hi everyone. Today's video is about how not to suck as a manager. Now, if you are a manager or you're thinking about getting into managing people, then this might just be the video for you. When we become managers, we all believe we're going to be good managers. We believe we are fair and reasonable people. We believe that we make rational, well-justified decisions. We believe that we communicate clearly and keep people appropriately informed. We believe that all of our folks know what is expected of them, and we believe that they will respect us as a leader. But if we all think that, how come we've all worked for a bad manager in the past? I'm sure if you've worked for anybody ever, you'll probably think of one occasion where you've worked for someone you thought, you know what, they kind of suck as a manager. So let's look a bit more at the sorts of things you need to think about to stop you from sucking as a manager.
Mind the gap.
Okay, first I want to talk about something that applies in many scenarios, and that is the phenomenon of explanatory gaps. An explanatory gap is where you just don't know something, you don't understand why something has happened. So for example, if an individual is thinking, why has my manager taken this action? Why have they made that decision? What is my manager doing? What are they trying to achieve? If they don't know the answers to those questions, they're going to make up their own answers. And who do you know that makes up good news? That's right, nobody. So what they will do is they will fill an explanatory gap with something invariably negative. They're going to think that you have some kind of evil agenda or that you're trying to get one over on them. It's very simple for that to happen. Yes, even if they trust you, even if you have a pretty good rapport with people, if there's an explanatory gap, the temptation is for rumor and all sorts of gossip to start filling in the blanks. And as I said, nobody makes up good news. Now, there is that aphorism, Hanlon's razor, which is never ascribe to malice that which can be explained by incompetence, stupidity, or human error. But unfortunately, that's exactly what we tend to do. If something seems to be not right, we're going to assume that there is some agenda at play rather than just thinking, oh, well, you know, the manager screwed up. So if you are a manager, always remember that if you allow explanatory gaps to grow, then people are going to fill them with negative interpretations. Okay, so the other thing you have to think about is your perception. How are you perceived by the people that are working for you and the people that are observing you? Psychologically, perception is reality. What people perceive is what they believe. They're not going to tend to stop and think that, oh, maybe my observations are not correct, or maybe my interpretation is not correct. You know, if they'll see it with their own eyes, that's exactly what they're going to think. So you have to manage those perceptions. You also have to act as a behavioral role model. So how you behave is going to inspire the behavior in others. If you behave appropriately at all times, it's going to be much easier to hold other people to that same standard. You have to have integrity as well. You've got to practice what you preach. What you can't do is be telling somebody else to hold a certain standard that you yourself are not prepared to meet. Most of all, when it comes to your interactions with your staff, always remember that there is a difference between being friends and being friendly. Yes, you can be friendly, you can have a good rapport, but always remember that they are still working for you. And if you allow that sort of friendly to become friends, if you allow things to cross that barrier, then what tends to happen is people will start to feel that they have extra latitude or potentially the ability to, you know, bend the rules because you're their mate and it will all be okay. The bottom line is that leaders have a huge influence on culture in an organization. So you have to manage your perceptions and you have to make sure that everybody lives up to the standard that you set, and most of all, that you stick to your own standard. And that's how you can have a big influence on the culture. Every now and then you're going to have to make a decision, and it is very rare in business that you have a decision where there's no downside. When you have to decide between a number of alternatives, there are going to be advantages and disadvantages to each one. So one of the things to think about when being a manager is knowing when to consult and when to dictate, or just make a decision and stick to it. There is something wrong if you are having to rely on force of will and authority to push your decisions through. There's something wrong with the culture, there's something wrong with the relationship between you and your staff if you are having to bludgeon every decision through. So if that's happening, then that's something you need to start trying to diagnose. Now, we're not talking about management by consensus. I'm not saying that you have to get people to agree with you all the time, but there are going to be occasions where people do need clear, decisive leadership. But at the same time, it is not an autocracy. People don't like being coerced. They don't feel like they're being forced into something. They like to feel that they have at least some control over their destiny and they're not just a leaf on the wind being blown along. Now, clearly there are going to be business decisions where it's not going to go in the favour of the individual sometimes, and those things sort of happen. But for most part, if you can bring people with you on the decision-making journey, they're far more likely to support the decisions that you make, or at least comply with them, as opposed to being active resistors. In a nutshell, my advice is listen to people's input, consider what they've got to say, and then decide. It can be very useful to get feedback from people, get their input on the decisions that you're going to make, even if you've got a very, very clear idea of what to do. By challenging your own ideas of what to do, by listening to the input from other people, you can validate that your decision is correct, or possibly come up with something a little better. Hooray! Remember, good leaders know how to balance inclusion with decisiveness. And this all ties into that wonderful thing of employee engagement. Next, I want to talk about something that is massively, massively important to absolutely everyone who manages people at whatever level, and that is early intervention. This is probably the single most important thing a manager can do to avoid all those difficult and nasty HR problems that pop up from time to time. Generally, and it's human nature, we have a reluctance to tackle difficult and uncomfortable situations. Nobody likes conflict, nobody likes tension, and so there's a tendency for us to sort of, if not look the other way, silently kind of ignore a problem in the hope that it will solve itself, it will go away. Sometimes you might drop a few oblique hints, hoping that someone will pick up on what we're suggesting and that they'll correct whatever's going wrong. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way. The longer you delay, the harder something is going to be to sort out. And this makes perfect sense. If you don't intervene on something, you accept it, you let it happen and let it rumble on, then when you do eventually have to take action, especially if you're forced to take action, people are going to react negatively. They're going to say, why now? Why are you complaining about this now? Why are you taking action now? Why didn't you say something before? Now, what are they going to do with that explanatory gap? They're going to fill it with a negative interpretation, right? They're going to fill it with that you've got an agenda. Oh, you've got some personal problem with me. That's why you're saying this now. It's especially bad if a bad behavior has been happening, you've let it go on, and you've tolerated it from other people, and now you think, okay, it's time to clamp down. So you pick someone, you clamp down on it, and of course that someone's going to say, well, you didn't say this when Joe Bloggs was doing it, or when Janet was doing it. Why are you saying it to me? You must have a personal problem with me. And of course, then they're not going to pay any attention to the standards you're trying to set. They're going to start seeing you as an adversary. You can imagine how difficult it's going to be to handle that situation. If only you'd intervened sooner, it wouldn't have been that difficult. Another thing to bear in mind is when there is something happening that's undesirable in the workplace, everybody is watching to see how you manage it. Not just the people that are doing it, but there'll be other employees who observe what's going on, and they'll be watching you to see whether you do anything about it. Your actions will determine how the workplace culture evolves and how people behave. And it's really important. Never let problems fester. I guarantee it'll only get worse, and then when you do end up having to do something about it, it's going to be an order of magnitude more difficult. Okay, this has just been an overview of some of the most common things to think about to avoid sucking as a manager. I'm just going to summarize now with some generic top tips that will really help you out in your management career. Number one, always keep a paper trail. It doesn't have to be physically on paper. You can type things up, you can keep notes, but when you have conversations, when you make decisions, it's always a good idea to keep a little note, just a summary of what's happened. You'll never know when you need to refer to that in future. Now, I'm not saying you have to keep it for years and years and years and years. Use a little common sense here. But if you have a verbal conversation with someone, especially if it's about performance or expectations, or if there's anything to do with an issue, then it's a really good idea just to keep a note. And if there's a decision or if there's some conclusion to that conversation, it's quite handy to follow up with an email afterwards. You can send an email to them saying, further to our conversation, I just want to confirm blah, blah, blah. Now, this is great because it gets on the record. It gives them an opportunity to come back if it turns out that they didn't actually understand or agree with what was said. But most of all, it stops that awful situation later where it's a he said, she said, and there's some disagreement about the events of the past. It's basically covering your ass. It doesn't hurt. My next top tip is basically coming out of the performance management training that I do. And that is to always ensure that you have set clear expectations on people. You simply cannot complain about somebody's performance later if you haven't made it really clear what's expected from them in the first place. And again, it's a good idea to write that down and make sure the individual has a copy. That way, if there's any disagreement later over them not delivering what you expected, you have something you can refer to, and that will make sure that the arguments are easier to manage if you have them. In particular, if you have a performance problem and you need to raise somebody's performance up, or worse, they don't improve and you have to manage them out, guess what? By documenting everything and making sure you've had all those expectations clearly set, you've got all the evidence you need to justify your actions. On a related note, always inspect what you expect. Review how people are doing. Give them feedback on how they're doing. Don't just point them in one direction, leave them to it, and then don't circle back with them until the end of the year or even later, because then it would be unreasonable to start complaining if they aren't doing what you want them to do. It's good to check in with people. I recommend at least once every quarter. Monthly is ideal if you can do it, but at least once every quarter. Review how they're doing against the expectations that you've set. Give them some feedback, and this gives them a chance to make any course corrections that are necessary. It also gives you a chance to identify any support needs that they might have that you perhaps didn't anticipate. And of course, the beauty of that is it blows any excuses out of the water when at the end of the year you want to hold them accountable for the level of performance that they've achieved. On the behavioural front, back to the early intervention point, always tackle problem behaviours. Don't let problem behaviours persist. Don't turn a blind eye. Don't just drop hints and hope they go away. And most of all, don't ignore them. Silence is acceptance. If there is something wrong and you don't do something about it, people are going to assume that whatever is happening is acceptable. And this will make it much harder to address later. With all of these things, though, the best advice I can give perhaps is don't shoot from the hip. If you are a manager, especially if you are new to management, you're going to be finding your way. It's going to take you a little while to come to terms with having this authority, this leadership role. You might find yourself second guessing yourself every now and then, or feeling a little bit unsure about how to tackle a particular problem. Don't be afraid to ask for help and advice. There is no shame in it. And there are lots of people who've been doing it for many, many years, myself included. And I have made all of these mistakes myself in the past. Everything I've just been telling you about, I'm guilty of them at some point. So we can help you in your role as a manager by giving you advice on how to tackle some of these situations. Again, don't be shy. There's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion. It doesn't mean you're a bad manager, and it certainly doesn't mean you're not smart. The difference between intelligence and wisdom is experience. And no matter how smart you are, if you don't have that experience, you are going to need some help. So don't be shy. We're all here to support you. And I think that is really the key point I want to finish on. We're all human. Mistakes do happen from time to time, so don't beat yourself up on it. If you follow the advice that I've given you in this video, hopefully the probability of some really serious problem occurring will at least be mitigated somewhat. Now, if something bad does happen, then that's where you can get help from HR. HR is not just some red tape cost that gets in the way of things. We're actually here to facilitate your management of your team and the business. We're here to help you get the outcome that you need. Ultimately, we're here to balance the needs of the individuals, the workforce, with the needs of the business. And if we can do that successfully with your help, then that means you end up with a happier, more engaged workforce, And if you have that, then they're going to be more productive and you're going to be more profitable. Basically, everyone can be a winner. If you like this video, please like and share. If you've got something to share with me about the content of the video, or perhaps some management behaviors that are particularly good or bad that you've observed, please leave a comment down below. If you know a manager who sucks, maybe you can share this video with them. Anyway, this is kind of an extract from a bigger course I've got on managing people and conflict. So if you're interested in that too, again, get in touch with me, leave a message. And most of all, if you're enjoying this content, please hit subscribe, and I'll be in touch with you again soon.